Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our united progressive movement. This week, we're joined once again to discuss some of the most important topics of the day, and to do that and discussing our technology and its impact on the economy, we have three great guests this week. We have on Josh, Joey, and Victor. I want to give them each a chance to introduce themselves to the Rosebuds out there. Josh, why don't you start us off? Tell them where you're from, how you'd like to just be referred, and what you do for a living.
Hey guys, my name is Josh, and I go by Josh Amazil on Twitter. I'm based on Oregon, and I work for pretty much for Intel, and I'm an electrical engineer.
Very cool. Well, we're very happy to have you on today, Josh. Joey, want to introduce yourselves to the folks out there?
Okay. My name is Joey. I'm actually Canadian, so I hope to bring sort of an outsider's viewpoint on all of this. I'm currently self-employed. Got some property management, and I do some management consulting on the side. And yeah, hope to have a good discussion.
Yes, and we're glad to have you on to be able to present that different opinion, as we all are very debating in America. People outside of
Mhm.
America love American politics too, because there's just so much drama to it and so much influence that gets extended to other countries. And the last guest that we have on is Victor. Victor, want to let yourself be known to the Rosebuds out there? What do you do for a
Sure.
living, and where are you from?
I'm Victor Tiffany. I'm upstate New York. I'm employed in information technology. I can't go into any greater detail because I have a hell of a lot of political enemies out there as the founder and chief administrator of the Bernier Bus Movement.
Well, we're glad to have you on. I doubt there's going to be much animosity from the crowd that we have here with the Rosebud, so we're very happy to have you on, as well as many other Bernie Sanders supporters. So I think the first question that I really wanted to get into when we're going in talking about the economy and technology is really seeing kind of where we are right now. One of the things we do, as I work in technology myself, I work as a management consultant, is one of the simplest approaches you could ever do is a SWOT. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So I just wanted to hear your opinions first on what our strengths and weaknesses are as an economy today. So Josh, what do you think our strengths and weaknesses are currently?
Well, let me see. I'm not very well versed in the topic. I did have some economics in school, but what I would think is our economic strength would be um, heavily upon like our growing economy. United States is top 12 in its GDP currently, with Qatar being the first place. Economic weaknesses, I would say, much falls heavily under like issues about income inequality and all those other issues. Um, Economic opportunities would be um, since our economic system is more like the capital is actually capitalist system. We thrive more on innovation and like high risk, high reward sort of approach into to the economy. So then there are like opportunities for like advancements in technology, like accelerated growth in all these in industrialization, and economic threats would be, as what Andrew Yang has pointed out, the more we ignore automation and the fourth industrial revolution of what that we're going into, more and more people are going to be pushed to the side, and just like what had happened in the history, we would have like riots and famine and all sorts of those things. So we need to address all these issues
Yeah, no,
and
I
threats.
can certainly understand you, and I think the statistic you were trying to cite before was like GDP per capita, in that you were
Hmm.
comparing us to like Qatar. You know, it being a small country, its GDP isn't massive, but per capita they
Right,
have that.
right.
So I
Hmm.
think there's certainly some understandable points there. Victor, what do you think really are our strengths and weaknesses currently as an economy?
Our strengths are clearly the entrepreneurial spirit that actually built this country, including the ability to suppress labor. And that, of course, leads to threats of inequality, as was alluded to, labor suppression of various forms. And another strength that would be the willingness to exploit nature in the extreme, and of course that is simultaneously a threat because we're pushing the limits of sustainability, and with climate change bearing down on us, what makes us a strong economy is the very thing that threatens our long-term survival. So in terms of weaknesses, I think the biggest weakness in the U.S. economy is currently living in the White House. It's a political thing. He's not a stable genius. So I'll just leave it there. And for opportunities, there's a lot of opportunities. I'm not as concerned about automation as many other people are, because with automation and displacement comes opportunity. This is nothing new. Joseph Schumpeter wrote about this, calling it creative destruction. A new technology comes along, and people who are employed in the old technology lose their job. That's nothing new. So I guess this is later on in the discussion, but there are ways to deal with this without necessarily basically giving everyone a basic income. But there are opportunities that exist beyond that.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with you first and foremost that our economy's strength is kind of a double-edged sword in that our strength does create its own threat. And I can certainly understand your point too that automation doesn't necessarily mean job loss. It just means job disruption. And usually that means that you have to be moved. And so we still need solutions to be able to adjust to that displacement, but it doesn't necessarily mean net loss. And we've seen that in the past industrializations of our economy as well. Joey, how would you kind of identify our economy currently? Where are you seeing our strengths and weaknesses really play out?
Well, Jonathan, like you, I'm a management consultant, so I do SWOTs a lot.
Yeah.
And so I wrote down a few points, and I mean, we can unpack them here or in a future episode, but I'm just going to blast through these because there's several per section. So I have a more macro view of economics because we live in a global economic society. U.S. economics is global economics. And everything essentially boils back down to economics as a root cause. So when I talk about economic strengths, it may not seem obvious, but I listed things like military strength because that obviously has economic concerns domestically and foreign. So I have economic strength, global reserve currency. That's foundational. Tech innovation is a big economic strength of the U.S. Like I said, military strength. This is underrated. Entertainment and cultural exports is a big economic strength. And as Josh mentioned, GDP, just the size of the economy, is a strength. And global diplomatic presence, which will always tie into a foreign economy or even the domestic economy. I saw those. I don't think America has held its dominance as entrepreneurial leader because Asian entrepreneurial, especially in China, Hong Kong, is massive. Just based on their population alone, they may have more entrepreneurs than the U.S. does as a total. Weaknesses. Again, because everything boils back down to economic, I see a polarized voter base as and a very bipartisan one. Like even in Canada, we have 3 major parties, but there's actually 5 that are. I mean, I'm voting tomorrow, and there's 5 major parties here in the States. It's Democratic or Republican, and then whoever independent shows up. Economic weakness, corruption, political, economic, and legal. They all have an economic outcome when there's corruption in those 3 spheres. And unfortunately, there's a tainted history, including slavery, because that's generational. And you'll see, African descendants of slaves starting to talk about um, how they've had to overcome, hundreds of years of slavery with this economic handicap. Um, Ideological illusions. I'm not a big fan of political theory, political ideology, political theater. Um, Economics it's a game of data and math and results, and it works or it doesn't. And people are poor or they're not. They're suffering or they're not, and that has nothing to do with ideology. And I think ideological illusions is a big economic weakness. Uh, and then there's the ego, military, cultural, global, political. Um, Policing the world, policing other governments, that has a domestic economic effect, and where your money is spent, and how it spawns radicalization, and then you've got um, um,
Yeah.
uh,
So, like, a lot of the things I'm hearing are kind of along a similar line to what we both had Josh as well as Victor say is they are dual-edged swords, both in the strength that you listed in terms of our global diplomacy reach and influence, as well as our problem of having again that reach and influence that people can threaten us in that regard too. So I think one of the things I'd kind of want to hear from you all is really how do we balance that growth versus risk nature in us? Currently, I think a lot of people are saying the narrative has really been wrong. We've been sacrificing so much in the pursuit of growth that we've left people behind. How do we actually start trying to address that problem? Josh, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, let me respond to what I forgot. uh, Not Troy, but
Victor.
Victor. No, no, you
Oh,
actually.
Joey.
Sorry,
Joey. Yeah.
Yeah.
Joey. Okay, my bad. I'm very bad with names. I don't see the names here. Anyway, so I just wanted to point out or respond to what the point that you raised in terms of global policing of the United States. Um, I originally came from the Philippines, and I studied a lot about our history and our deep relationship with the United States. For a very long time, we've been a great ally to the United States. And as the more you dig into it, it's um, global policing. There's always an underlying incentive to why U.S. is doing this. Um, the main point is that the Philippines, it sits on a very strategic location in Asia. So it was to their benefit to save the Philippines from the Spanish colonization. So all throughout the years, and we go through that. Just let me time skip to, like, let's say 1980s, where we had our economy booming. Our GDP growth rate were like 9% to 10% every year, and then the U.S. again decided to intervene in the government system, and we see levels of drop in GDP and the economy and poverty rate. All of those got, in pretty much income inequality, all of those spurred. So I think, it's all tied together. I think whatever US is doing why they're going to other countries is always tied to an incentive, a political incentive, a military incentive, a resource incentive. So it all ties back down to economics, as what Joey has pointed.
Yeah, no, I could certainly understand that. It's kind of redefining what is our incentives in the situation. We sometimes oversimplify things to give it in more of like a bite-sized piece. And I think trying to figure out how to balance these dual-natured threats of advancing through innovation, taking risk, but having some way to protect against that downside. Victor, did you have any thoughts on that, on how we balance that?
Yeah, I'm not even sure balance is the right word. I think we need to address the limits of growth. So one of my mentors in grad school was Stephen David Ross, who wrote books about inexhaustibility, which has got to be poised against limits of growth. And we're bumping up against some of these limits. So I'm not sure growth even makes any sense anymore. I think what we need is selective growth, and what the Republicans absolutely oppose, which is picking winners and losers. And I don't think it's going to be up to the consumers. And this, we're really talking about almost a transformational, a cultural transformation, in that right now, corporate advertising and on so many media, I mean, television, radio, driving down the road, everywhere, every chance they get, they're encouraging us to spend more money and consume more stuff and drive this economy higher and higher and higher, because it's a consumer or demand-based economic system we have for the most part. And I think we're creating our own demise. So I think we need to challenge this whole understanding of growth broadly, and really start thinking about, what about spiritual growth? What about non-material growth? What about ways we can analyze the economy as successful to more and more people without economic growth of GDP being a factor? I think growth is basically a way of digging our own grave, and we need to reevaluate the whole need for growth. I think this is a parameter that's established by capitalists more than it is humanists. I think we need to change our values and change our priorities, because if we don't, we're staring at human extinction in the eye. I mean, Chris Hedges just had an article on Truthdig about the new radical evil. And it's really neoliberalism, which is capitalism on steroids, a particularly predatory form of capitalism. And if we don't somehow start changing our culture, consuming less, consumers could drive this economy. If we were to collectively make this decision, we could drive this economy into a recession and make Trump far more easier to defeat if we were to operate in concert. But again, that would require this whole new modality about thinking about consumer, getting lights off that we don't use, turn the television off that we're not watching, stop driving around for the fun of it. A whole range of anti-consumer attitudes and approaches, so that we can actually survive this transition we're going to have to go through into a post-growth, post-neoliberal world order, if we're actually going to survive. So I don't have all the answers, but I think part of it is just the need to stop buying so much new stuff. Stop buying. If you need it, buy it. You need a battery for your car, you need a battery for a flashlight, you need a new battery. But if you need a coat, you can get a used coat. Or if you total your car, you can get a used car. We can slow the economy down, and I think we have to basically fire all the economists who consider growth in GDP to be the lead indicator for economic success.
Yeah, I think
I would like to respond to that.
Yeah, I'll give you a moment to respond to that, but I want to chime in on that as well. I think there's a lot of interesting points there. I first want to say that I do think we do need to challenge the notion of growth. The one thing I would want to defend is that it's not necessarily an anti-capitalist approach to actually wrap your mind around not trying to be just pro-growth. Sometimes when you look at companies, being a management consultant, we look at companies a lot, you'll see a business line will become overly mature. And so when you reach that point, if you're constantly pouring new resources into that business, you're not necessarily getting the same return on investment that you need. You're exacerbating costs in terms of it not having that scalability, so you're wasting money on administration. And sometimes these mature companies come to the point where they realize they don't necessarily have the right command. They keep putting the resources in the wrong spots, and so they redistribute that money back out in the form of a dividend. That's one way that you can say, okay, we've already gone to the cap of what our normal growth here is. We're going to keep plugging along because these are still strengths. People are still going to need these things. But then you return that money back so people can innovate on it. So I think there is a mindset that we can have within a capitalist framework to challenge the notion of growth. So I'm curious, Josh, what was the thought you wanted to add on to what Victor had said?
I just wanted to respond to growth. Yes, I agree that we shouldn't just focus on GDP as a measurement of growth. And Andrew Yang has like touched on this briefly, wherein I watched one of his interviews where he emphasizes that GDP was made 100 years ago, and the economist that said this is not good for well-being, that we shouldn't we shouldn't use it for that. So there is a way, since we are already a capitalist economy, we could steer capitalists into being more human-centered capitalists, wherein you just have to align the incentives of um, businesses, or the bottom line of the corporates, to align with human well-being, just like um, life expectancy, how our children are doing, um, income inequality, all suicides and drug overdoses. Those are things that we care about, and we have the capital to do those things. America is like $20 trillion. How many zeros are that?
Yeah. So I'm going
So
to
that's
get to
just
you
my
on that, Victor. I just want to give Joey a chance to jump in on here. I think one of the questions that's really coming up in between these two points of view is, are you just putting the baseline incentives and still allowing the consumer to make his decisions even if they are potentially wasteful? Or do you have more of this command style where you say, this is something that is going to be to all of our benefits. We need to take this corrective course. So we're going to make this decision more forcefully, in the sense of, okay, rather than saying a carbon tax, we're going to say fossil fuels is illegal now, potentially. These are like a diameter that we've seen kind of between these two camps. Joey, where do you kind of fall on that? Should it be more of an incentivization or more of a direct action against?
First up, I want to agree completely with both Victor and Josh on this one. Victor's absolutely right. Infinite growth paradigm, it's a dead end. If you even think about it for even a couple of minutes, we live on a finite planet. Infinite growth is an idiotic philosophy. What we should be striving for is stasis, stability, and sustainability, and that's a binary choice. If it's not sustainable, it's unsustainable. So anything that we do that's not sustainable is inherently unsustainable. So, we should be looking for efficiency, not growth. Doing more with less, not doing more with more for the sake of growing GDP. And because, like Josh mentioned, it was never meant for human well-being. It was just an economic statistic. In terms of whether we use carrots or sticks, again, this is why I don't like ideologies, because certain ideologies will go with a certain set of legislation or policies, and another set will go with another one. Let's deal with what works. And like you said, Jonathan, as a management consultant, companies are going to do what companies do, what they were built for, and what their mission statements are. And rules, regulations, and laws are just other elements of that game, but their goal doesn't change. It's still the same thing: maximize profit, maximize shareholder value, maximize capital accumulation. So it doesn't matter how many layers of laws, they're just going to find new holes. They're like raptors around the fence, just poking holes in the thing, trying to find loopholes. You have to change the carrot. It really is about the incentives, and that's one of the things I like most about Yang is he keeps saying it's not a rules problem, it's an incentive problem. You talk about bad actors all the time. It's not bad actors. They're just actors. And they're actors following whatever rules you put in front of them. And if they look bad, it's because the rules were bad. So you can change the incentives among bad policy and bad legislation. You can have a whole, I mean, probably half the laws still on the books are bad. But if you get the incentives right, they become moot. They become inconsequential. Or you can try and write all, perfect 100% foolproof rules. But if the human psyche, psychology, social psychology is contrary to those rules, it doesn't matter. Life will find a way. People will find a way to continue doing what they're doing. See, it is all about carrots.
Yeah.
It's all about carrots.
So I can certainly understand that. I see kind of one of the ways of explaining it is like a force of gravity. People have their mission statement. They have the point that they are driven to as the fundamental purpose of their being. Sometimes putting the rule in place is like trying to put a wall in place. But as we know with our debates on walls themselves with our country right now, they're very ineffective and they find ways to get through it. It's costly to put it in. The administration to be able to do it is incorrect. The other way to do it is you go and try and establish another point of gravity so that people are incentivized to a new point. I'd be kind of curious. Victor, you wanted to respond back when Josh had made a point. What were your thoughts here in trying to change it between an incentivization versus we as a society need a movement force to say we're just not going to do this anymore?
Well, I'm obviously on the latter side of that, but I really wanted to tease out something Josh had said, which is the way he changed the dynamics of the capitalist system and talking about humanizing it. I think he might be changing the whole nature of, not the whole nature, a fundamental nature of the system, so that we're not talking about capitalism necessarily, but and not socialism either, but maybe a new form of humanism, a new form of economics that is people-centered rather than corporate-centered, so that somehow maximizing profits is a secondary goal, not necessarily neglected because no business is going to survive that way, but somehow reinforced through public policy, a rule that allows corporations that are responsible to survive, not necessarily making huge profits, but surviving and thriving in some sort of situation. I just don't understand why we're clinging to capitalism as a label instead of something a little more humane sounding.
I think that's a phenomenal point. I think it is really, do labels serve us justice, really? When we are really saying here is the base goal that we're driving to, capitalism may just be an antiquated label like the measurements we kind of were using beforehand in GDP. It might not actually be accurately describing the situation. And I personally like to kind of describe myself as like a social democrat. I really think it is, you have this balance between the two where you're really driving things towards that social good. And I think one of the few areas technologically that we're really having this debate come up is automation. Automation isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are a lot of jobs that are very monotonous, routine, that are being basically treating humans as if they were robots currently. And so maybe it can align them to work that is more purposeful. In our economy today, only 15% of people are actually satisfied with the work that they're doing. And so this might help realign them to things that are more purposeful. How do you think we should be assessing automation? Is it a problem? Is it an opportunity? And what do we really do about automation? Do we have any thoughts, Joey, on this automation? It's clearly Andrew Yang's biggest topic. You've been aligned on him. Is opportunity our threat or opportunity?
It's definitely an opportunity. Before I move on this, I just want to make one point on Victor's statement there. He's absolutely right. Capitalism as a label is it's meaningless right now. Some people use it in a political sphere. Some people use it as an economic one. I think Josh was talking about it economically. I think Victor was talking about it politically. I mean, you could say that a democratic socialist is probably bad labeling and bad branding too, because then people call it socialism, right? And you can say human-centered capitalism is just as bad because people are going to call it capitalism. So, I mean, if we can remove those labels completely from any type of useful discussion, that would be a win for everybody. Now, in terms of automation, it's absolutely an existential threat
Mm.
if you let it act upon you. If you just let it happen to you unprepared, it's gonna create a giant mess. It's inevitable. All the top consultants and economists, they all agree, like 30% in the next 20 years of jobs subject to automation. Even if you took the low end of that, 5, 10%, you display, and this is globally too. This isn't just a U.S. problem, right? Like China is the largest consumer of industrial robots on the planet. So you're talking about displacing Chinese workers too, right? And their population is like 10 times the size. You're bringing in, the third industrial revolution was democratization of energy, and then you're bringing in the fourth industrial revolution, which is AI, automation. Job displacement doesn't mean elimination, like you guys mentioned earlier. It means removing it from where it is now, respawning it in some other form, and then relocating it to somewhere else where the resources are available for those jobs, which leaves the people displaced in the wrong city with the wrong skills and late to retrain for those jobs, right? It's different people, different places, different skill sets. It's too fast and too soon. So reacting to it after it happens, like after you hit 30%, it's too late. You got to get it now while it's still early enough to react to it. And how you react to it is, I guess, where the debate is. I think we need to accept it, harness it. We can't fight it. You can't, unionize against automation. It's ridiculous. There are countless jobs that are dangerous, unhealthy, hazardous, toxic to human well-being. They should not be done by humans, and it's immoral to force people to keep doing those jobs. We should embrace the automation behind it. We need to engineer and design our way into this industrial revolution, and it looks like open source, crowdsource, zero marginal cost, sharing economy, zero cost subscription model. I can unpack that later if you want. And this automation fundamentally erodes the market economy and labor for income paradigm.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with you in the sense that it is inevitable. I think anyone who says that we are not going to continue to make progress to, say, certain jobs that are routine we can replace, that is instinctually the motive of any business or simply household. You try to make things more efficient, as we were all saying beforehand. It's not growth, it's efficiency. We're trying to do more with less. I'd be curious, Victor, do you think it is something that is soon enough that we need to be proactive now? There have been several candidates who have said this is being a little bit overblown at this moment. We acknowledge it's a real thing, but we don't need to be addressing it now. Do you think automation is something we need to address now?
Sure, and I think the answer is a combination of what Bernie's proposing and what Andrew's proposing. I moderated a debate once between UBI and the government guaranteed job. And what we didn't explore at the end is combining those two into a single coherent policy where you can use a UBI or some sort of sustenance from the government to help people transition, especially those in fossil fuel industry. I'll give you an example because this is something they're going to have to stop working at, and Bernie Sanders elaborates on this. But in the meanwhile, they're going to need, it's not just, something to sustain them until they find something else. They're also going to need, again, this is another Sanders proposal, education, free education, so they're not going into debt to train up in artificial intelligence or digital technology or whatever. So I think education is key, and you can't always get that. People don't always know, I didn't realize they were going to replace a cashier, for example. Oh, I didn't realize they were bringing in these machines that are replacing me. So it can't always be ahead of time. Corporations don't always announce, you better start getting another education because your job is not going to survive. They can't do that, I don't think, for the most part, because people would say, well, screw you, I'm just quitting. I'll go find a job that will keep me around for a while. corporations want to keep people around until they basically can throw them out with and replace them with machines, automation, if you will. So there has to be sort of a position in place that keeps people secure, keeps people creative, and gives them options when their job has been automated to, as Andrew points out, do whatever the hell they want. If they want to become an artist, that's great, and be able to sustain them in that process. Or if they want to, you know, have a more productive lifestyle and shift into, I don't know, automation, you know, technology themselves, repairing robots, designing robots, they should be provided with that kind of education so they can also accomplish that. So I think we need to shift from, and I am actually ideologically oriented. I think we need to get the hell away from this neoliberal ideology that's market and corporate based and get into a humane or humanistic ideology that's human centered. And I think Andrew and Bernie are both pointing sort of parallel tracks in that same direction.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you that they are both aiming at a common goal, and I think there is certainly merit to the debates between these policies. It's not like either one of them is a completely outlandish thing to be discussing. We certainly can have those from our opposition across the aisle sometimes. This is something that we can say we are allies, we are working towards the same goal. Let's flesh this out along the way. And at the end of the day, that's what happens once you nominate someone. The people are kind of interjecting their voice. They're saying, we think that this might be the path to get there. Then after the nomination, you're hopefully building up a platform that you can all rally behind afterwards. And so hopefully in that process, both of those two people who I don't know if they've actually had a chance to work together at all yet or have like a fleshed out conversation on these topics beyond these 30-second bits on stage where they get to interact. So hopefully they can maybe find ways to incorporate both in. I'd be curious, Josh, where do you kind of fall on the subject of automation? Do you think it is really an existential threat right now, something that we need to prepare for that's coming later? Where do we really fall on that?
In my opinion, I agree with Joey and Victor on both points that they have raised. About automation, automation is inevitable, and we have to recognize it as some sort of existential threat. But we do have to emphasize that this is a job displacement, right? It's not elimination of jobs. Yes, pointing to Joey. The fact is, if we don't prepare for it now, which I could really see it right now because I'm currently, working in the field, and I wanted to point out to all the listeners out there, it's not just automation of repetitive tasks and cognitive abilities. We have developed technologies that are machine learning that mimic complex tasks that the human brain does. And this has been patterned from the studies on neuroscience that bridged into technology. But I'm not saying necessarily we're going to become cyborgs, but I'm saying that we have the capability to have robots themselves don't do repetitive tasks. So an example that I would give is we currently have an AI named Lisa. Lisa is a leasing agent software, and she pretty much takes all the emails, questions, texts from all the consumers. No one is behind. There's no operator. Lisa responds to based on natural language processing method, wherein there is some sort of library that you input into a neural network model. I don't want to get too deep into that, but I would recommend people look more into that because we're currently really advanced in that technology right now. And I don't think people are realizing that there are a lot of corporate incentives to do those things. That we can't just keep denying that. Oh, there's it's only gonna be those cashier jobs that are gonna be lost. It's only gonna be those, repetitive tasks that are gonna be lost. So this is just a plain warning that we should look more into it and prepare for the displacement. So I'm really concerned about the displacement because right now, I'm working, and not not for long I wasn't really caring about other people. I only cared about myself, to earn money for myself so I can live. And I think most of us are in that kind of mentality. And the work that you do, you go to, and I'm gonna transition into education. Yes, free education is great, and I didn't get free education. I went through it, paid for education with the incentive or the motivation that if I get education, I'll be better in life, right? I think we all can agree that most most of our parents or adults would always advise you to do that. I went into education, focused on the STEM field because that was, there was a lot of money in the STEM field. Obviously, he called me greedy, but that's what it is. But I never realized that, the things that I do, like automation and everything, is actually going to affect day-to-day workers, day-to-day American citizens. And only up to people are not realizing this. And, I don't want to like harp on that, but yes, free education, that is, I support that a proposal of Bernie Sanders, and I think Andrew Yang has some sort of way to do it too. What I'm trying to, wanna get through with education is that yes, we could say free education, but we have to take it further. We have to emphasize in vocational and technical training, apprenticeships, and all those things. You can't just plug everyone to a basic classroom setting. These cashiers or truck drivers might be better with actually using their hands, applications, not necessarily bookish type of people. So yes, go free education, but also focus on vocational and technical training in the transition, as long sorry as well as you have the government chime in on this. You also have the corporate chime in on this in terms of they have to pay in the transition that the jobs that they're going to be replacing. So it has to be both the government and the private institution funding that transition.
I think that's an interesting proposal, and I'd be kind of curious to see how Victor kind of responds to the idea of beforehand we were really trying to be more guiding in where the economy needs to go to meet these challenges. Sometimes the problem that people have with the idea of free college compared to something like free community college or vocational schools is that there's a lot of different areas that people can study that don't necessarily meet those demands that necessarily corporate America or the jobs programs that public jobs are offering. How do you think we can balance that when we're trying to propose these free education systems to help transition these people?
Well, I think it's going to have to be up to the people. I mean, the whole idea of liberty is that we make that choice. Right? It can't come from the government. It can't come from corporations. We can't keep allowing others to run our lives for us. And I just want to speak to something that was said about funding whatever approach, whether it's UBI or college or whatever. We have textbooks, economic textbooks that are largely obsolete. And those who know, and I know this is a tangential subject and completely maybe for a whole new separate discussion, but we now understand, and it's been proven, that our tax dollars don't fund the federal government. Local government is a different story, state government is a different story, but tax dollars do not fund the federal government. The federal government funds our taxes through spending, which gets circulated around the economy, eventually comes to us in the form of income, and then we hand some of that back to the government. But it's not. But our taxes aren't paying for anything. So we need to separate that out, and we discuss it maybe later on or in a whole another scene, another episode if you want. So I just think, we need to, maybe I'm old fashioned and liberal in this regard, but I think we need to keep in mind the interest, the human interest, which is, liberty. I mean, liberty for everyone, not just those who can afford liberty, but the cashier's liberty. So and that's why I like the idea of a combination of a UBI and education. When I said education, I wasn't talking about necessarily 4-year university education, vocational training, whatever anyone wants to pursue. If they want to pursue a career, technical training, whatever kind of training they need, they shouldn't have to pay for it. They should be able to just get it. And then, the government will pay for it. Does that answer your question?
No, I think that does get at a lot of it, and I do think it would take a much longer conversation to go into MMT theory that really gets behind a lot of how the funding of real taxation and spending goes, that I think you were kind of alluding to, Victor. I think the thing that I kind of wanted to get out of that is I think we do agree to some sense that education is 100% necessary. I think it's really just a fundamental fact of how does that come into play? Are we really getting at the base root of it, which is the cost as well as the usefulness afterwards? It does nothing necessarily beneficial to you if you're getting fully educated on something that doesn't necessarily have use. It's great in terms of maybe exposure. You can take that as your free time. But if someone's getting a full degree and then they can't get hired afterwards, that could be a problem. And so I totally understand we need to lift the burden in terms of being able to transition. But I think there's a lot of exploration of how do we really apply funds for that cause. Joey, do you have anything on that before we go to the next topic that we have?
Yeah, generally for this conversation, I was trying to avoid platform comparisons, but I just wanted to make one note since Victor brought it up. Yang's not opposed to federal jobs at all. He has a full plan for infrastructure jobs, green jobs. He loves the Green New Deal vision. And I'm glad to hear Victor say that he is, federal jobs plus UBI, because so is Yang. I think the concern is that Bernie is anti-UBI, and that's sort of the sticking point. Yang does not have a problem with federal jobs. He does not have a problem with people getting an education who want it. And the other way he was able to skin that cat was you make a college affordable, like as affordable as it was back when it was like just a few $1,000s, and then you drop the UBI in there, it essentially becomes free. But if you didn't want to go to college, you could use those funds for something else. It's not a lost college voucher. For example, I mean, I went to university 4-year program. It took me 6 years because I switched twice. I actually went into engineering. Then I went into business information systems, computer programming. Hated both. Not that I couldn't do it. It's just it takes a certain persona to pursue either of those. I ended up in marketing because of the combination of math, creativity, psychology. But to think that everybody's going to want to be an engineer later, or everybody's going to want to be a coder later, that's a stretch. STEM fields are only like 8% of all jobs, something like that.
Yeah.
So I'm for federal jobs. I'm for UBI. So is Yang. He's not against federal jobs. The guarantee part is a little problematic because you don't want to get into the Chinese iron bowl situation. You can look that up later. Like automation is not just robots, like Josh said. It's tech efficiency. I'm running an entire management consulting company solo with gig workers working remotely at zero marginal cost, well, approaching zero marginal cost, because you've got these expats working in Thailand for their local rate, but they're producing U.S. quality work product. So tech efficiency has a way of sneaking its way in, and to guarantee jobs for all the 30% of people who are going to be displaced is assuming there's going to be a job to give them that's actually efficient and not just for the sake of a job. So I think UBI sort of helps resolve that. There's a loose end there that needs to be clipped, and I think UBI resolves that. But I'm going to leave platform comparisons for another conversation.
Yeah, I think we could kind of go all day, and just so we can kind of go past this topic, because I think we will get trapped into a UBI versus full jobs guarantee if we allow it otherwise. I think Bernie has shown himself in the past to have some affinity for UBI. He just says it's like not the highest priority, usually is his stance on it. So I don't want to say he's pure against it. He just thinks that other things are the higher priority. I think...
Yeah, well, he's on the record saying that he thinks people like jobs.
That is definitely true. I definitely agree. He's made statements that have gravitated more away from that to be able to sell the full jobs guarantee. But I don't think if it was something that was necessarily like passed by Congress, Bernie Sanders as president is coming in with a veto pen. I think that's really where he is kind of standing at with that policy. But I want to go to a next topic. One of the ideas
can I chime in like really
sure,
quick?
I'll start with you on this, and you can add on to this question. But the real topic I wanted to get to is one of the topics that was brought up at the most recent debates, and this was done by Andrew Yang. I think a lot of the technology conversation has come in from that, is really the idea of data ownership. One of the ideas is being able to have that tech check for your data. I was curious, how do you guys feel in terms of the idea of data transfership requiring some level of approval and some level of compensation towards the end user whose data is being transferred? How do you guys feel on that? Should we be getting a check for each sale of our data? I'll start with you, Josh, on that.
All right, cool. Just wanted to point out the previous topic, and I just want to add this. It's not about like Yang or Bernie Sanders, but I just wanted to raise this topic that we need to recognize value that is on work that is being done but is not compensated in our society. So people like single moms and caregivers, nurturers sacrifice their time because they want to care for their family, and that's great for the society. That's humanistic. At the same time, we also want to look at those people that are great in arts. Do we necessarily need to encourage them to go to a 4-year university studying arts and not get a job after? So some form of art is human nature. Actually, it's just the creative mind of the human. So I think I just wanted to add that into that discussion, because it'd be great if if myself. Originally, I didn't really want to become an engineer because I really loved it. I wanted to be a musician. So I'm just kind of like forced into thinking that being a musician doesn't really get me anywhere. And I don't get
drums.
Money from drums, guitar, and everything. Yeah. All right. Moving on to the data part. Yes, data should be a property, right? And so the thing is, people don't really know right now that, not people, most everyday Americans don't really know that Amazon, Google, and all the tech companies all have their data at their disposal, selling it back and forth through other companies and other services. And, they think like, for example, you sign up for Facebook. You sign up for free, right? But that is their way of buying you into their platform so they could get your data, which they could resell and use as like a bait to these marketing and advertisement companies, pretty much. But not only that, if you've recently on the news, there's like a 20-year-old that CEO that um, found a company that pretty much gathers data and sells it to the tech companies, and it's doing really great right now. But all of those data gathering are free, and we don't have any control where our data goes. So I'm just want to hammer the point that data is our property, and it is a right, and we should know where it goes. We should know when, we should be informed on where it goes, how much is it worth,
Hmm.
what's the value of it, and we should also have the right to retract all of that data at our will. Because if you think of it as like our personal property and property right, I mean our houses that we bought, we don't just like give it to other people. And
Yeah.
so data leasing would be a way to also fund the UBI. Maybe even make it more than a grand, to help with the basic necessities. So I think um, it's great that he pointed that out, because we need the next president to have a weigh in on this. We've been suffering because of not having an Office of Technology Assessment for, I don't know, decades now. We're falling really behind on regulating technology. We should have some say on it,
Yeah.
just to close that.
No, I certainly agree that we do need to have just a more overall comprehensive approach on technology for the government. And I do think that I have to agree, property in terms of our data is essential to establish just as an idea, because data itself is not something that we can like feel and hold and own like a house or necessarily visualize. So it is something that needs to kind of just be an idea that we can universally accept. And I think that you're right in terms of we need some form of notification for that process. I'd be curious, Victor, do you have a similar mindset for data, as well as any of the other points that he had brought up in terms of the idea of what work really is in terms of its constitution?
Yeah, I don't agree, and I feel almost reactionary about this. There's an expression: if you're not paying for a service, you are the service. If you're not paying for a product, that you are the product, and that's certainly the model of Facebook. So what we're doing here is really challenging that model. I mean, we sign a user agreement that gives them permission to use our data, right? So we get this service, which we in the Burn Your Bus movement, at least on social media, take great advantage of. I guess I'm biased because I like the model the way it works now. We do extract value from it, but it's not data value. They have our data. Yep, they use it for whatever they want to use it for. They sell it or whatever, and I have no rights to it because I signed them away when I signed up for Facebook. But we're in there actually exploiting Facebook in ways that I don't even dare elaborate on, because they would ban us if they found out what we were doing. Yeah. But no, I mean, the whole thing, the whole discussion, I mean, talking about challenging and saving our data and getting paid for use of our data just flies in the face of the current model, which might be okay, and they would have to come up with a whole new user agreement. But I don't really care too much if they use my data. I don't see a big problem with the status quo. So,
Okay.
like I said, my views are almost pretty reactionary. It's like I don't care that much. I signed the agreement that, yeah, go ahead and use my data. And if the government forces Facebook or Twitter to come up with a better agreement, I'm fine with that too. I'm not. I don't care that much about my data as a property right.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
maybe you would care when you find out how much information you have that is on the internet that is accessible to anyone that could get access to your credit and all your bank accounts. Just putting it out
Well,
there.
that's now we're crossing over into hacking and
Yeah,
violation
yeah.
of
well,
privacy and
I
so
don't even
forth.
know if it necessarily has to even go into hacking. I think one of the current concerns about it being a property right is downstream. How far can it go? So if I give my information to Facebook, yes, I've made an agreement with Facebook. I have
Yeah.
said, I am getting a free service from you. You are entitled to be able to sell my data. But now, in selling that data, it's gone downstream. I haven't necessarily made a user agreement with the downstream party. That data is free for them to use and use to future parties as well. I think one of the concerns that we have is that you don't necessarily need to hack to get this data. It is
Yeah.
going from hand to hand and it can just be more readily accessible. So I think part of the idea of being able to get some form of compensation and having this come up front in the user agreements is establishing what your baseline of privacy needs are. So it's more
Mhm.
clear what data is being sent downstream, saying I'm okay with this being sent, I'm not okay with this being sent, I can have these features because of that. I think it's about the transparency, and if you are a more private person, you could set a really high price and you just don't want to use their service. Maybe you're not as much of a private person, you could set a really low price for what you want it to be used at. I think that's something where it's just
Mhm.
a kind of transparency play. I do completely agree. It is screaming straight in the face of status quo about the idea of getting something for free. I think a lot of people don't really realize what free is other than, oh, cool, I didn't have to take anything out of my pocket. So I think
Mhm.
we do need to challenge at least the idea, as Josh alluded to, in terms of culturally, whether we go full throttle in terms of saying you get to price everything. That's definitely a debate. Joey, where do you fall in terms of this being property rights?
Um, okay, so considering that we're currently in a monetary market economy, um, yes, it would have to be paid for. It's a property right. Um, in 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 a later question, you asked what our vision is. In a resource-based economy, a non-monetary market economy, it actually won't matter, and
Yeah.
it should be used for what they're using it for. But we'll stick within the context of a monetary economy. Um, Data is worth more than oil right now.
Yeah.
And that would be an entire 2 hour discussion to explain why that is, but it is. Um, and data is food for AI. Josh
Yeah.
knows this.
Yeah.
It's food. AI can't do anything without data,
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
which
I
means
agree.
it is the fundamental economic input for all AI based technologies. And AI based technologies are the ones causing all of the displacement, or most of it. And we're not talking about just like basic automation, like assembly line type stuff. We're talking about like high level machine learning, complex um, job displacement. So if your data is the food for the AI that's putting you out of a job, there has to be some reconciliation there. You have to be able to get some of that money back in the form of a UBI. Um, if you want to increase income inequality, keep giving your data away to these giant tech companies to make more money off your data and not return any of it to you. That will increase income inequality for sure. It's happening right now. Amazon is only as rich as it is because it can anticipate everybody's future purchases and stick an ad in front of you or a recommended purchase in front of you
Mhm.
because of the 100,000 people who went before you and bought the exact same combination of goods. So
Yeah.
now Amazon has benefited from your data, didn't pay you anything in federal income taxes, and increased income inequality anymore. So a little surprised that Victor, being a burner, um, who's against income inequality, doesn't see how returning data privacy rights and value to the original data owner reduces income inequality. Um, and we're not talking about voluntary data. You're saying, well, I signed a letter saying that you can have my data because I get to use your service for free, pro quo, right? Well, you could say that about a minimum wage job too. Hey, I accepted at $7 an hour. Here's my labor. Here's my paycheck. But you're jumping in and saying, hey, 15 isn't enough. Well, we're jumping in saying 0 is not enough for your data. There has to be a minimum wage for your data. So if you're for minimum wage for labor, you should be minimum wage for your data too. We're talking about metadata. So when you GPS, okay, I'm going to go to this store today, and it says it's going to take you 15 minutes. They tracked that. They know where you went. They know what type of store you went to, so they actually know what you just bought without signing away any of that information. This is the metadata, and it's being collected at volumes that are beyond imagine. The amount of data that they're using, and it's fueling the AI, and it's making them rich, and nobody is seeing anything from it. Like Thomas Paine said, there's an inherited commons for landowners take land and they improve on it and they make a profit, but that's commons. Every generation is entitled to the land that we live on. This metadata is commons too, and they owe you for using that to their advantage. This isn't just like we just happen to recognize your metadata. No, they're going after it. They're venture capitalists funding businesses whose sole jobs is to find ways to more efficiently extract your data, extract the value, and make the rich people already more rich. And to Jonathan's point, it's not just a money thing. It's convenience versus privacy. If you want to give up some of your convenience and have them pay you for it, cool. If you want maximum convenience, give away all your data. Cool, but you should at least have that choice. Like you said, it's liberty, right? You should be able to choose. They shouldn't just be able to take it, grab it, and do whatever they want with it.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of interesting points there, but before I go into it, I want to give Victor a chance to respond. Victor, what are your some thoughts on that in terms of having some minimum compensation in terms of like a minimum wage comparison?
I'm trying to wrap my head around the mechanisms. I mean, basically, we're just talking about applying UPI. I mean, Facebook isn't going to send me a check for using my data. I just don't know how. If I were fully agree with everything that's being said, how's this going to work other than through some sort of government policy? I mean, and that's not a rhetorical question. That's a real question. I just don't understand how it's going to work.
Yeah, I'd love to give you that. I don't know if everyone here on the channel knows or even this audience knows, I'm actually running for Congress, and I have a proposal just for this. So it's actually one of the things I'd love to plug right now. So I was talking about it today with a friend. It's basically a system where you would use a database, basically ownership, where you as Facebook, if you have a new user coming in, you have to transfer the ownership to the actual government. It will then have a blockchain access system where you have already given access to the company that's done the transfer to it. If you would like to sell it downstream, you need to have a baseline agreement of who the owner is of that data, the end user, and they would set a price to be able to release that data out as a transaction. And so you'd have an immutable record log in terms of that transfer from user to user, so that you'll have some form of payment coming back to the original owner of that data. So that's really the system, so that you're having one source that then has access points, that's being managed by the federal government, that has free license to the original company that collected that data.
Yeah, it's no different than trademark or copyright. That's data, right? It's patented data. That's all it is. So your name, your company name, a slogan. It's one unit of data. It's tracked. It's trademarked. It's registered. It can be sold. It can be bought. You're just talking about like every minutia of data points, but with AI and technology, it can keep track of all of that, especially on blockchain too. So it can't be corrupted. To not implement or seek or study or explore something because you don't intuitively know how it's going to work is a really bad way of seeking progress. Because I'm pretty sure they didn't know how desegregation would work immediately, especially the people on the right. And they wouldn't throw it out just because they didn't know how they were going to integrate all these races. You know what I mean? Like, I know that's a little extreme, but I think throwing the baby out with the bathwater is a little extreme too. So.
No, but I certainly hear what you're saying in terms of one of the philosophies I have is when you're setting goals, you have to first be an idealist. When you're being a solution-driven person, you then are the realist. But when we say, what is our goal? Should data be a property right? Should we find a way to compensate people for that? That's where the idealism comes in. Yeah, we should have that as a principle. It should be something that's owned. It should be something that's controlled. Now, when we're talking solutions, yeah, we can get into that minutia of, okay, how do you compensate them for that? How do you maintain that control? That kind of like gets to that next step. So I definitely agree with your point there that we can't just say the unfeasibility of it means that it's something that we shouldn't aim at. I obviously think it's a little bit of a straw man of what the comparison was to slavery, but I think you're right that we need to try and challenge those preconceived notions and not limit ourselves by the technology.
Not slavery,
yeah.
desegregation.
Okay, fair enough. Not slavery, but desegregation still. Before I move on, I want to give Victor one more chance before I get to my next question. What are your thoughts on that? Should we really be having this now that you have like some proposals that can kind of get at that goal?
Yeah, like I said, it's not that I opposed it. I just didn't have strong feelings about it. I guess I'm so used to having my data abused and used without my permission that it's like breathing.
Yeah.
Or maybe breathing slightly toxic air. You get used to it, and you don't think, oh, there's a better way. Maybe I should, charge or something. Anything that will improve the situation is fine. But I haven't given it that much.
No, I think that's totally fair. I think that comes into play with prioritization. Like as we were saying, even in that pricing idea, some people are going to be like, yeah, just keep giving me the service for free, like convenience sake. Some people might care and have that whole privacy concern too. And I think this is one of the great things about still having some level of ideological diversity within the current primary field is we're getting a lot of these different thoughts in there that we might not have thought. Or even when we have these allies with common goals, we can say, oh, there are actually a couple of solutions on how we get here. Maybe there's a balancing act that we can kind of strive towards. And I think one of the things we can all agree about is that we're all fundamentally challenging that status quo thinking. Whether it be Yang with how we're measuring stuff and that thought of government in terms of its incentivization, or whether it be Bernie in terms of the movement forces and really calling out these powerful and corrupt interests. I'd be curious how we can really fundamentally bring these advancements and innovation also into the process of governing. How can we actually improve the way we all work together by actually utilizing technology? Josh, do you have any thoughts on that, of how we can really help government operate better by using technology?
All right, let me think about this real quick. So, let me draw like a simple analogy. It might be oversimplified, but throughout the years, I think technology has been great in democratizing speech or free speech. I think maybe not free speech, but I'm looking for another term for that. But more
like publishing, like publishing. Like everyone's a journalist now. No one would have heard of me in the past. I can just have an online podcast. I get what you're saying there. Yeah.
Right. We could like reach so many people just through the internet. Like we could get our voices heard. Like this discussion that we're having. Like people, if you publish this on the internet, a lot of people can see it all throughout the world. You're not just in your local bubble of like, let's say in your city. So I think there's that like positive thing that technology has done in that space, in a way that technology would improve government is maybe it's kind of hard to like kind of draw the line or like the connection because the government hasn't been really caught up to technology. So technology is way more advanced. That's why we're having this discussion. Technology is way more advanced and our government's trying to keep up to it. So now technology has to pull the government back up and and pull it up its, hold them by the hand. I mean, there's really like kind of right now would be, in my opinion, would be kind of muddy to to like recommend something that I would know, but technology, we could make the government more technology friendly, um, just like our taxes every year. Um, the government like knows pretty much our yearly taxes. Maybe there's some sort of uh, like difference in itemization, but technology can help even make that more efficient. In like every year we go file our taxes. We take so much. Some people take so much time for it. Some people pay accountants to do it.
Yeah.
Like I
No,
think
I
maybe I'm
understand
looking
what
at
you're
more
saying.
specific.
No, but like, no, that makes sense to me. First of all, we're talking about automation as a theme. What's something that we do as a repetitive task regularly? Taxes are definitely one of those things that we can start to apply this technology to. And I think there's also some understandability about it being so uncertain. Government is this behemoth of bureaucracy that's been underfunded over the years because it had no like competitive structure to go against. And so a lot of the technology just itself, like the computers they work on, like not even like specialized technology, but just like the operating systems that they
Oh,
use, they're just like very outdated compared to what the technology we use today is. I'd be curious, Victor, do you have any thoughts on things that really the government should look towards these technological innovations that have already occurred and start bringing that in house?
Well, sure. The way the question is framed is a little confusing because I have more of a libertarian approach toward how we can use technology not to improve the government, but to get the government the hell away from our business.
Ah,
Right? So I'm thinking encryption. Our technology, the technology we use, so that radar detection, speed radar detection. We want to make. We don't want the government to notice how fast we're going, right? So that's the technology we use to to keep government from being effective, giving us speeding tickets, to keep the government from being effective, listening in on our conversations or our chats. So encryption is a way that we use technology to protect us from government. Now, if the question is how can government use technology to improve government, clearly state of the art. Let's get again. There should be no limits on what government can spend to improve government services and to improve government efficiency and services and so forth. So they should be. That's really up to Congress to stay on top of this and get the top of the line operating systems and get the training in place so that the government employees know how to use this. I certainly support, because if we don't do it, China's going to be doing it or India's going to be doing it, and we're going to fall behind. So it's certainly something that needs to be done. And again, I hate to harp on this, but price is no object. We can afford to do whatever the hell we need to do.
yeah, no, I certainly understand and I agree that's something that Congress needs to do. But I also agree that technology does go both ways. It gives us an established relationship that is acceptable with government in terms of that privacy aspect as well. So I do think there's two sides of it because if technological innovation does become way too strong in the power of the hands of the government, it can be used as a force of oppression as well. We've seen
right,
that more specifically in the case like China, as you were kind of alluding to. That's one of the ways
right.
they imposed their censorship. As much as we said technology kind of unlocked this freedom of speech within our country, technology has also given China the ability to halt that free speech within their
Well,
country a little
what
bit
does
too.
Snowden call the NSA's capability, the architecture of authoritarianism? Is that his phrase? It's there. They're just not, to our knowledge, using it the way China's using it. But it's there. I mean, that's why our organization uses encrypted messaging service. And I just found out from a discussion on I-24 news out of Israel that the service we're using is not allowing the governments in to snoop around. That I don't even want to give a brand name at this point, but we're using
A
technology
virtual VPN.
to keep to keep government out of our business, because we see, this, I don't like using the phrase deep state, but there's a CIA guy who is sort of blowing the whistle on what he calls a shadow government, and this is all tied in with the establishment and our revolution, the Bernie's revolution. This is a revolution. We just want to keep the establishment out of our plans, what we're planning doing, what our next tactic is, what our next maneuver is. So we use an encryption service, and it's a different answer to your question, but it's the way you frame the question in the layup. What preceded this is how we use technology, which is a different question than how government uses technology. And obviously they need to stay on top of it.
Yeah.
But part of the problem is, by staying on top of it, they create, again, Snowden's word, the infrastructure for authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think technology is a very interesting thing because a lot of the different aspects of life, it requires balance, and really between three aspects. It's technological innovation for the people, technological innovation for companies, as well as technological innovation for government itself. Because we need government as that check of power against corporate abuse. We need to make sure that we're not being abused like we currently are by both government as well as corporation. So we need that individual power to be able to reclaim back our rights as individuals. And finally, we need corporations to be able to do that, because that's where we're really driving forward our influence as well as innovation truly in its base form, because that's where you can take risks and have failures and use those market forces to say this is the path we should go down for these technological ventures. Joey, how do you think we should really play for that, one of those pillars, the government pillar? How do we really use technology to help that? Because I think of all things, the individual and the corporation right now are a little bit further ahead than the government is in terms of technology.
Yeah, yes and no. Make no mistake, the U.S. government is on the leading edge of a lot of technology.
Yeah.
It's just in the wrong department. It's in the Pentagon. It's in, like you said, it's surveillance state. They're using AI to predict terrorist behavior. Like, they're not behind the curve. It's just in the wrong sector. Ben Goertzel, famous AI scientist, he said that we're currently training. So AI is narrow AI, right? Very specific. It does one job. It's not good at general stuff. But all of the individual AIs together will train each other to eventually create an AGI, or artificial general intelligence. If the sum of all of our dumb AIs right now are focused on surveillance and maximizing capital, like Wall Street algorithms, that's the AGI that we're nurturing. And that's not the AGI we want to nurture. We want to nurture an AGI that's being used to maximize human well-being. So all of the big data that we talked about that feeds the AI, that can be used for good. It can be used to, instead of monitoring and surveilling for nefarious purposes, let's monitor and surveil people's mental health. Societally, I'm talking like big picture wise. Let's see, what's causing the opioid crisis? You could plug that into an AI and they can figure that stuff out. That's what we should be using it for. We should be using big data. We should be filling the halls of Washington with data scientists, data-driven, because when you have the data, decisions don't have to be made anymore. You don't have to debate the philosophy. You don't have to debate the ideology. When you have big data, the decision is arrived at, right? Think of a thermostat. It knows when it's too cold because it measures the temperature. It knows when it's too hot because it measures it. That's it. All you got to do is measure it. I don't have to give it a decision. We don't have to debate. It just knows. You can measure society. You can measure the velocity of resources. You can measure consumption patterns of anything, and arrive at decisions that make the most sense. Are we over-consuming guns, right? Is the data telling us that the overconsumption of guns is leading to more successful suicide attempts? Okay, well then that's a decision that doesn't have to be made anymore. We just arrived at it. Let's cut the guns down, and it produces lower success rates of fatal suicide attempts. Cool, no problem. Other ways, universal broadband will enable us to blockchain referendums, blockchain voting. If we want to find money, tax the rich, consumption taxes, blah, 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 but also make government more efficient. Use industry best practices. Like if Amazon is able to maximize its productivity using XYZ benchmarks, well, then the government should be able to do that too. So in that sense, Jonathan, you are right. They are behind the curve because a lot of what we interact with and engage with as consumers, we've been spoiled by the level of convenience and predictive behavior that all these other companies have, but not the government. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't know that you just moved, even though you changed your address and your driver's license. The other 20 departments don't. You know, there's like
it'd be great if we had that for voter registration. If I didn't have to do something like that, it was just an automated process. But I think one of the fundamental things I might want to challenge a little bit, and this is going to lead me into my next topic, is data is in itself just is what it is. But there's how you pick and choose data. Because instinctually you can say, okay, I had a study, it was done, here's the data from it. But you have to analyze, how was that data produced? Is that data an outlier? And I think this comes into play in a dangerous manner in certain subjects where it does have large impact, where we have people clinging to data points that are invalid. Take the subjects of like climate denial, of people who don't think it's a man-made problem, it's just part of a overall trend in climate. It's not our involvement in fossil fuels. Or another one, like take vaccinations. You'll have people who do studies and say it causes autism, but those studies are largely outlandish and debunked. And instead we have 99% of studies that say that vaccinations are safe and effective. My point that I would want to ask you all is, how do we establish the data that needs to be used? How do we establish that authority of having the incentives lead us to those correct sources of data? And for the people that aren't following those data, how do we get them to come along with us? Victor, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, especially on climate science. There's a great video out there on YouTube using worst case scenarios, right? So if the climate scientists who are telling us that it's fossil fuels are wrong, but we go the policy of Green New Deal and other things, then we'll end up wasting a lot of money. And worst case scenario, we'll have a worldwide depression that'll last a decade or two. That's worst case scenario. If the climate scientists are right, but we follow the approach of the denialists, the Glenn Becks, the Donald Trumps, then the worst case scenario is planet Venus, Earth, right? We're all extinct. So logic would be one approach, and this guy in this video does a very good job of making this case. And you could do the same thing with vaccinations. Right? If you don't vaccinate, you just look at the worst case scenario under who's right and who's wrong. But unfortunately, a lot of people who are in denialism can't wrap their head around logic. I had this presentation in an interview with a libertarian who didn't agree with, who's practicing denialism, and I laid this logic out there, and he says, well, you're talking apples and oranges. And I was being nice because he was the host and I was a guest, and I didn't want to come back to him with, no, you just lost an argument that you can't wrap your head around. So that would be my answer is in a certain sense, the antidote to bad speech is more speech, right? The antidote to bad logic is more logic. The antidote to bad science is more science. So you just have to keep coming at them. The last thing I would take is forced education, re-education camps, jamming, forcing people to think in a certain way. That again goes back to the opposite of liberty. You just have to make the best case you can and hope that the people are smart enough to make right decisions, whether it's in a polling booth or the next car they're getting, or whether or not to vaccinate their children. And unfortunately, some people aren't very bright and they're making bad choices. There is no what's the phrase? There is no magic bullet here. You have to do the best you can. You make the best case you can, and you try to point people to the best arguments on whether it's vaccination or climate change or whatever.
Yeah. So I certainly agree with your point, largely that exposure is the best way to correct course. Shutting these people out is just going to leave them with their existing thoughts, and probably more stubbornly so. They don't want to admit to wrongness because it's a blow to ego as humans.
If I could just give another quick example, Tulsi goes into the lion's den to make her case for peace. Right? She doesn't preach to the choir. She goes into the lion's den. And that's where she makes her case with people who disagree with her. And I think we all sort of need to do that. I think climate change advocates need to get on Fox News, to give another example. Things like that.
No, I certainly agree. I think it really is. You have to say it to the people who haven't heard it or who are fighting with it. Just saying it in our echo chambers doesn't really move the needle at all. We all are already aware. I think one point I would have maybe slight disagreements on is just the idea of just looking to the worst case scenarios. I think you do need some probability it factored into that, because otherwise we're going to have the doomsayer people who will just say, why care at all? We have Y2K. Why care at all? We'll have the rapture. I think there is some level of you have to bake in some probability into the play, but I also agree we can't force people into this educational mindset, and we're going to always have some level of disagreement of what the probabilities are. I think we can only make our best case arguments, and hopefully in the case of climate, we could say, you may have thought it was 10%, I moved the needle and now you're at 30%, I do it again with you, you're at 40%, and so on up the scale. But I'd be curious for Joey and Josh, one of the things at the end, and actually before I go to you, Victor, you had mentioned in terms of vaccination that we just kind of have to hope that they come to that logical conclusion. Would you say that vaccination is something we shouldn't have as mandatory?
I'm very ambivalent because I'm torn in two directions. I think we should maximize the liberty. So no, we can't be forcing people to do things. And on the other hand, we have the welfare. Right. What is the phrase from the
immunity
preamble of the Constitution? Oh. It's there to improve the welfare of the nation, and you can't let too many people go unvaccinated, or else that will go down. So I think there has to be a balance between mandatory and what's mandatory and what's not, what's liberty.
Yeah, I certainly agree. There is a balancing point that we all need to strike. Joey and Josh, on that specific topic, do you believe that it should be mandatory? And then secondarily, do you believe that we need to be doing something more about this disinformation, whether it is more education that's forced, like in our schools, having some form of climate science that has to be included, or do we have more of we just try to do it through normal conversation? Josh, what's your thoughts on those two subjects?
I'll start with the vaccination issue. I think, yes, we don't want to have a lot of people unvaccinated, but yes, we also don't want to mandate that because we're going to be forcing people. I think, I guess my view is more of a neutral stance in this, wherein, yes, it's great to have freedom, but I think that freedom should come with a consequence, So I think the best thing that we can do is to keep informing people. So if those people take the decision to not undergo vaccination, then they're willing to accept the consequences, or maybe let them sign a waiver You know, I know that it's not like the best approach to like making everyone healthy, but I think that that is some sort of a way to make people realize that they're making bad decisions. Because if you keep like if you mandate that, those people that are skeptic of the vaccination, they will never they would look for the wrongs of it, like causing autism and stuff, and they're like, oh, I don't want that. So you have this like weird um, unnecessary polarization that is for the well-being of people. So that's my take on that. Probably not the best take on it, but I want to move into um, si- how can we better like approach this issue about climate change. Um, so my view on this is that there are people that are claiming to be climate scientists, but actually have an underlying incentive to be a climate denier.
Yeah.
And I think as humans, we could sense that. We know that what other people's motivations are. So I think it's always up to us that to see through that lies, but it's also up to society as a whole to start with the younger generation of making them more resistant to lies, like make them more skeptical, make them more critical thinkers,
Mm.
you know, like uh, don't just like force data into them and then make them believe it. Make them critical thinkers. I think that's the main thing. Because yes, data is all over the place, but the problem that we're having is the people that are interpreting the data
Yeah.
and making it come out as a certain conclusion. So I guess my take is, keep educating, keep informing, um, show the bad consequences, and make them decide, I guess.
No, so I totally agree with two of the parts there. I think, yes, we can basically say there is a baseline standard. If you want to be a public citizen, this is what we're expecting of you, and public citizens get these access requirements, but we're not going to just come along and start injecting you with a needle in that sense of mandatory. Like, there could
Yeah.
be both the carrot and the stick. You're not going to get this, but you can have your freedom still. We're not going to take that away from you. And then I also think it's definitely a good point in terms of the educational process for addressing these information gaps. It's really more so teaching people to critically think rather than saying, okay, there's falsehoods in this subject now. We now have a course on this subject. It's more
Mm-hmm.
giving people the way to process information rather than just giving them the information. Joey, where are you kind of falling on this in terms of how we get people to come to correct facts? And then, secondly, in the cases like not autism, in the cases of having mandatory vaccination, do you think that's something that we should be doing? Basically, the people that are, by society standards, rejecting the scientific information, should we force them to do it anyway, or should they have that right to opt out?
Okay, this is a tricky one in that the, science denial is a symptom. It's not a root cause of anything, right? You have to ask yourself why don't people listen to the science? And it's a trust issue, right? People don't trust what they hear on TV. They don't trust certain Congress people. They don't trust elected officials on the opposite side of the aisle. Okay, so how did they become so untrustworthy in the first place? And I think it's a result of manufactured consent, just in the wrong direction. It's manufactured consent of distrust, and that starts early, right? Like we deregulated advertising to children during the Reagan era, And now all of a sudden we're hyper consumers.
Yeah.
Hyper consumers that don't want to give up that consumption for supposed climate change. Well, can you imagine if we manufactured consent in the direction of science? People would be more conscious of sustainability, ecologically friendly practices, behaviors, right? So what is manufactured consent? That's media control now. So we have to get back to regulating media towards children in all different forms. You know, I don't want to take stabs at certain cartoons, but I mean, I personally don't let my son watch anything that's not educational. Like he's growing up on Sid the Science Kid, Magic School Bus, and, you know, not TMZ or random YouTubers that we don't, you know, can't.
Yeah.
You know, public television does a lot of good. So defunding public television, like that's manufacturing consent in the wrong direction, because you're letting private companies raise your children. And we know it takes a community to raise your children. I understand as a libertarian, you might say, no, my child's my child. Sure, you're allowed to feel that way, but the reality and the data says that when a community raises a child, you have the collective knowledge of all elders imprinting onto that child, and they are better off. They're better socialized. They're more conscientious. You know, all these beneficial factors. So if you listen to the data there, again, the decision is arrived at. It's not debatable anymore. We need more mental health resources. A lot of this denial, this mistrust, it's a fear of, I don't trust that doctor because he's just getting paid by the pharmaceutical companies and he just wants to sell more vaccines. Okay, so now people are conflating political corruption and legislative corruption with actual, you know, medical science. We need to improve trust, and I love that Yang actually recognizes that public mistrust of government is leading to science denial, right? If they're going to believe that terrorists are after us every single moment of the day, so you got to give up your liberties through the Patriot Act, and you can manufacture that kind of consent, you can also manufacture consent and say that we can build a rocket and get to the moon because we know the science about it. You know, pick out your phone in your pocket. Everything that came out of that phone, every text you send on any social media that you love to spend 24 hours a day on, is driven by technology, and technology is saying X, Y, Z. The climate is warming. Vaccinations are resulting or lack of vaccinations is resulting in a resurgence of polio. Like I just watched that Bill Gates, Getting Inside the Brain of Bill Gates, on how he's trying to combat polio, and he can't get those last few edge cases in Africa because people aren't getting vaccinated. So again, the data arrives at your decision. No, you can't force science on people. But you can remove the barriers that make denial hit dopamine receptors, right? Because denial feels good. If I deny that the earth is round, I now have a clan of other people that believe the same thing as me, and I'm finally accepted in some sort of a group of some sort. I've been ostracized my whole life, and I found home in flat earthers. Oh, well, okay, I just hit a dopamine receptor there. Well, let's stop whatever barriers are creating these dopamine hits for all these bad ideas, and let's get these dopamine hits towards good ideas. Because I feel good when I protect the planet. I feel good when I leave a healthier planet for my child. Let's hit those dopamine receptors.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think a lot of people are going to be hitting the rewind button a little bit, going back, listening again right now.
3 cheers for dopamine receptors.
But I think it's really important. The 3 aspects you really touched on. One, like, what are the points of influence?
Dopamine.
Oh, nice. But like, one is the point of influence. We have gatekeepers in our society, media being one of them, government being another, and we've lost a fundamental trust in these institutions from acts of deregulation that we've seen not just in the Reagan era, but it's both sides of the aisle. We also had it with the Clintons in the 90s as well, to be able to say that you no longer as a news organization have to just report the facts and what happened. You're allowed to actually start inserting opinion within it as well. So this is bipartisan issue currently. I think the next point was really, if you want to influence change, you start with the youngest generation, the people who are actually learning, who have more capacity to have things really imprinted on them. And I think the third thing is you have to really make it inviting. Basically, as you were kind of alluding to, you wanted to have this you're in the in-group feeling, that you're not this just rebel, that there is some consequence to it in terms of there should still be a social stigma to it. Like, if we're not gonna, force this onto you, but yeah, if someone you find out is like a flat earther or against vaccines, you should be
So
like,
you have the MAGA.
come on, let's get you to some better sources. Like, you're not a bad person, you've just gone down the wrong information sources. Have you checked this? Have you checked that? And I think you're absolutely right. It's, at the end of the day, science, if you do a study and no one hears it, it has no meaning. It's all about who actually hears it. A lie can go around the world much quicker than the truth sometimes. So we really need to focus on how information is like transferred. And so I want to go now to the last topic that I had for the day before we get into our 3-on-3. And it's a really simple one. Where do you think we have a current technology today that is going to have an underrated impact, and what's that impact going to look like by the year 2050? I'll start with Victor. What are your thoughts, Victor? What's a technology that's under our radar currently that by the year 2050 is going to have a real impact on us potentially?
I may have to skip and let someone else go first because I'm sitting there ready to tell you what I hope to see in year 2050.
Oh, okay.
Is this a combination of 6 and 7?
Yeah.
Those two?
Yeah, I mean, we're approaching the 2-hour mark. My audience is gracious, but, I'd like to keep this together, and they make sense together. So I'd be curious where we really see technology that is happening today that we're really not talking about that much, that's going to have a real big impact come that time of 2050.
I have one, and it combines with what I was going to talk about on 2050, which is I haven't explored it that much, but they've got something they can put in the lawns now, and it absorbs carbon at a much higher rate than a normal lawn would do it. And if everybody would include this into their lawns, embed it, bury it, I'm not even sure what you do with it, but somehow you include it in your lawns. If people just started using this, it would have a impact decreasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. It's a big natural sort of carbon sink, and that's what I like to see in 2050, which is carbon that's below the levels, well below the levels now. It's closer to 350, which is considered as 350 parts per million, which is considered more sustainable than, where are we, over 400 now? Mm-hmm. And a technology in place, and I'm not going to spell out exactly what that technology is going to have to be, but some form of geoengineering that addresses the positive feedback loops that are in place so that we cool the planet artificially. And I don't know what that is. I don't know how to do it. I have some ideas as a technologist, but I don't want to get into that as much as I want to talk about the second half of that question, which is how do we get there? How do we get to a sustainable future where temperatures have stabilized and if not cooling underway and carbon is vastly reduced in the atmosphere compared to now? And the answer is, way back in 2020, the American people had the wisdom to elect President Sanders with Vice President Yang.
Ooh. Mm-hmm. Bold take out there. Okay. Hey, I can get behind that at least. I don't think it's likely. Both Bernie and Yang.
Actually.
Bernie and Yang have both said they want to put a female on the ticket. I would certainly still like that ticket, even if I have it flipped potentially. But I certainly can see what you're saying. I think carbon sequestration is a very important thing, and I think it should not just be like one big sink area, but spread between communities, individuals having it as their lawns. I think that's a really good idea, and I think it's really important, as you kind of mentioned. Yang is one of the few people bringing geoengineering really into that conversation.
He is.
So I think that's certainly something we need to consider. I'd be curious, Josh, what technology do you think is really going to drive us forward and have a lot more of an impact than we think by the year 2050? And how do we really get it to get to that point?
I don't have any specific technology in mind, but just the concept of sustainability. So if you look at sustainability, it's a wide range of different technologies coming together. It's you got the renewable energy resources, you got the carbon sequestration and geoengineering. All of those things factor into sustainability. So I think my idea would be, once whoever is the 2020 president or vice president for both, I would love Yang Bernie or Yang Tulsi. That's my bias there. But what I want is to kind of have this some sort of requirement for um, new new buildings or cities or to be developed focused on sustainability, because it's harder to make existing cities or existing neighborhoods sustainable, because we have to tear it apart and then put the mechanism in place. So in areas that we have space or land that are not being used, we could definitely start building cities in those areas. Maybe a part of America that receives, more sunlight, that would be great. Maybe a part of America that's, um, closer to geothermal energies. So there's like a multi-prong approach for this. I think we we as a society need to start thinking that all like recycling and stuff doesn't really get us very far. It's more like big and bold ideas that we can all come together and agree upon.
No, so I think that's certainly true on three aspects. I think first, it really is almost a little foolhardy to think we know the technology today that's going to have the most impact in 30 years. The pace in which technology is growing kind of makes that a little bit obsolete thinking. I don't think even 30
Mhm.
years before now, they might have been thinking about smartphones or even that concept of having the whole worldwide internet in your pocket, essentially. So I think you're right that it's more multi-pronged and that it's really focusing on just the approach of sustainability. They have the whole engineering like
Mhm.
concept of, you measure twice, you cut once. It's a lot easier to do something right the first time and then reap the benefits of it than try to fix and correct course. So
Right.
I'd be curious, Joey, do you have specific technologies in mind, or is it really more of this broad sustainability approach? I think both of them have alluded to climate technologies more often. Is that where you see the most impact occurring by that time, and how do we get there?
So timeline wise, like 2050 is 30 years away.
Yeah.
And if you look back at the last 30 years, what we've accomplished, where we came from and where we are right now, technology's grown by leaps and bounds, and it's only accelerating. Um, uh, my prediction is not a passive one, but a reactionary one. The the technology people at home should look up the most is machine learning,
Mhm.
and AI. If you know anything about machine learning, AlphaGo is a really good documentary. They took one of the most complex intellectual games, harder than chess even,
Hmm.
and they created a software that beat the first professional in 2015. It beat the world's best in 2016. It created a version of itself that beat itself a year later, 100 to 1. And then they built another version that required no human input of rules, algorithms, gambits, nothing. It learned from scratch in 21 days and beat that version, all within the span of 2 years. Now, you can apply this to anything: self driving cars, medical diagnosis, protein folding, they're using it in, math proofs that have to this date never been solved by human minds. AI machine learning algorithms are solving these math proofs. If
Mhm.
you extrapolate that sort of um, learning curve exponentially for the next 30 years, you're at AGI. Like they're getting there. They said AGI is coming in like 10 years. And that's when you hit the singularity. That's when AGI is coming up with Nobel Prize winning strategies every second. That's what they're predicting here. Okay, so let's say they're off by another 10 years. They double that. That's still 20 years. You're still 10 years ahead of what this predicted model is. So if you imagine a world where AGI is solving all of these complex problems that we have and all this human suffering at Nobel levels every second, it's unfathomable. Like it's Star Trek. We're talking about Star Trek here, and that sort of brings me to what my vision is. You're going to be in a resource-based economy, not a market economy. You're going to have optimal automation where, people aren't doing the work; they're just solving problems. We're all engineers, creators. That's our job, and we're all scientists and explorers. That's our job. Or we're all caregivers, or we're all just part of the social fabric. Entertainers, you name it. We have maximum mental health. Everything's commons. Everything's open source, everything's crowdsourced, and we value access over ownership because ownership is actually very inconvenient. And the enabling technology for that vision is machine learning AI.
Well, I'm certainly happy that we concluded on a more utopian vision of what we could be in 2050 compared to how some view the threats of technology potentially by that time. But with that being said, I want to get into our final segment, which is the 3-on-3 questions. These are a multiple choice prioritization of proposals. You can choose one of the 3 options or none of the above. I'm going to go through, just get your answer, then I'm going to come back again and get your reason. We'll do this pretty quickly. Don't want to draw everyone out into the proposals because these are my own, so that can happen a separate time. I can do separate videos on that. But the first set of options here for you all is, first, this was something we were talking about beforehand, data as a property right. Being able to pay you at a rate you choose for the dissemination of your data, as well as the notification of sale. The second being the freedom dividend, with an amendment to make payments biweekly and also $300 a month for every child. And the third is free internet and broadband expansion fund incentives. I'll start this time with Josh. Which of those 3 would be the highest priority for you, or none of the above?
Well, I think all of them are great. Those are very well thought out like proposals. I guess my priority would be free internet and broadband expansion.
Okay.
So we have to get this resource to everyone. Most people are being like left out. Mostly the poor that don't have access to the internet, and we have to get that resource to them. It's pretty much an artificial resource that we made.
Yeah,
It's not
I
some
hear
sort of
you.
natural
It's
resource
certainly like
that,
a fairness thing too. Like they
yeah.
definitely need to have that access. But I'll go more into the explanations afterwards. I'd be curious, Joey, where do you land on those 3 proposals?
I, I ranked them. I thought that's what the task was. I put freedom dividend first and foremost because that's a mental health issue. It acts as a antidepressant. It removes the mindset of scarcity. It's also an enabling policy towards that vision that I was talking about. If you can start moving towards a universal basic income, then we start adopting automation, not fighting it. Next, I would agree with Josh, free internet, because like we said, we have a manufactured consent problem, and access to the correct information is key. I mean, if they can watch that Netflix docs that I watch, then we'd be at the same point, right? And then I'd put data as a property right afterwards because that's more of a monetary compensation thing. And like I said, in my vision of the future, monetary compensation is not good for anything. So,
Okay, that makes sense to me. How about yourself, Victor? Where do you fall between the 3 proposals?
Yeah, I was going to agree with Josh until Joey made the case for UBI or the freedom dividend as a priority, and that changed my mind. I think the freedom dividend first, the free internet second, and then data as a property right as the lowest part of those 3.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense given your concerns previously with the data as a property right. I think all 3 have some level of understanding that we have to make technology fair and that we have to redistribute the benefits of that technology back to the citizens of our country. So I have my own struggles kind of going between the last two, but I really think the freedom dividend lets us bake in all those incentives to work for us back into a manner that doesn't punish the people at the bottom that are still using those services. With that, I'm going to go now to my second question. The options are, would you rather have an annual national referendum and an election day holiday so that we can have it annually? Would you rather have ranked choice voting? Or would you rather have paper ballots and a vote being counted system where you can be notified when your vote's been counted and you can challenge how it's been counted? So this time I'll start with Victor. Victor, between those three options, which is the highest priority for you?
Yeah, this is easy because I've already wrote a chapter in our book about this. Paper ballots. We have a system that fundamentally can be rigged and robbed. Until we have hand countable paper ballots so we can check the actual vote counts, we don't have a democratic order.
I think that's certainly fair. I think we need some level of an audit trail. And I think having some system in which you're at least told, hey, your vote's been counted, this is how it's been counted, that gives you some faith and trust in the institution itself. How about you, Josh? Between those three proposals, the national referendum and election day holiday, ranked choice voting, and paper ballots, as well as a notification and challenge system, where do you fall? Which is the top priority for you?
I guess the third option, the paper ballots, was a good idea until I experienced it. So I'll get into that maybe later, but I would prefer ranked choice voting more because it gives us more of it kind of destroys identity politics because what we all want are solutions. And yes, we do want to elect the person that's would carry through the solutions, but it could be done by, leadership is, you could take it from any standpoint. So I just want to add into the paper ballot fact. There is still possibility to get paper ballots be corrupted or to skew the votes very easy. And maybe it's just the implementation of it, or maybe how it's counted, or is it still people that are counting it, or because my experience is more of coming from the Philippines where we don't have like an electorate system of like electoral college system. We vote, every vote matters, and we do it through paper ballots. And over almost every presidential election, we have issues with miscounting of votes, vote buying very blatantly on precincts, and those volunteers that like are counting the ballots themselves are being paid to skew the votes. So I mean, I want to be more positive about it, but the experience is not. Maybe you need to have more checks and balances with the voting system. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's certainly understandable, and I think that's part of the reason why I give the part two of that proposal, which is really having some form of notification when your vote has been counted, as well as a challenge system so that you can see how your vote has been counted. So that way you at least have an understanding of whether or not that corruption occurred on your ballot or if yours was simply ignored. Before I go back to Victor to be able to have a response on the paper ballots points that you made, I want to first have Joey's answer. Joey, between those three, where do you really fall? Is it a national referendum and election day holiday, ranked choice voting, or paper ballots and the notification/challenge system?
Well, happily, Yang's for all three of these, so you don't really have to choose if he wins. But if I had to rank them, I kept them in the same order, actual. Annual national referendum and election day holiday. Voter suppression. I think, I don't have the actual numbers on this, but I think voter suppression, the number of people who aren't voting and voter participation, it exceeds the number of corrupted ballots. So if you're talking about like bang for your buck, I think making a national holiday, giving people the day off, because the poor are usually the ones who don't take the time off work to go vote. They also have a hard time getting there, and then you've got all the issues with closed polling and the difficulty of getting there to the vote. I think an election holiday would make sense. And I kind of like the referendum idea. I've always been more of a direct democracy kind of guy, and we have the technology for it. Like I said, blockchain-enabled referendums. Who's it? Nerds for Yang lives in a Scandinavian country. I can't remember which one off the top of my head, but they have like quarterly referendums. And they vote from everything on like how many F-22 fighters we're going to spend our money on this quarter, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The more times you vote, the less likely to corrupt the entire voting sort of process. You know what I mean? You'd have to have a concerted effort to target every single referendum simultaneously and corrupt each of those ballots. You know what I mean? So it kind of washes it out. The bigger the sample size, the less effect the ballots have. And then I would have been more for the ballot thing if you said blockchain voting, not paper. Not paper. If you're looking for a safeguard, I think I know it's not ready for prime time, but it's the superior solution.
Yeah, so I understand that being the invitation, and I certainly welcome Andrew Yang to actually adopt the annual national referendum. In your point that he has it all, he has parts of each of these. I wish he had that full picture. But before we move on, I wanted to give Victor just a moment to say why paper ballots themselves are the most effective solution, why you think that's such a high priority.
Well, I like blockchain, actually, for the primary way of doing it, but I think paper should be a backup, just in case someone can figure out how to hack blockchain and change the outcome. I think we have to have a backup, something we can hold our hands and physically count. And I also want to address so many people not voting. There was a study done by Thomas Piketty published in 2018. People don't vote because there's no one to vote for. The poor and the poorly educated for 70 years have been sitting out elections. We wonder why are so many people not voting these days? And the answer isn't because they can't get the polling place. They don't want to vote because there's no one, according to Piketty, like a social democrat to vote for, which is basically the Bernie Sanders democratic socialism. And Yang might be able to get these people to come out and vote for him too, just because of his UBI. You know, if you're poor, $1,000 a month sounds mighty nice. So that might be enough to actually get them to vote. But people aren't voting because, and this is certainly the case in 2016, they didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. They didn't want to vote for Donald Trump. They stayed home. Democrats, poor people, poorly educated people, and of course, far too many Bernie supporters.
Yep, no, I certainly understand that point, and I think really all three of these that I was putting forward as the choices were about giving ways to invite people to vote, whether it be having a national referendum so that you have more of a right to vote on not just candidates, but directly the legislation itself, whether it be ranked choice voting so that you're not voting against people, you're really voting your values, or whether it be having the paper ballot or blockchain ballots with a notification system so that when you're actually going to vote, you know that your vote is actually being heard and counted and not corrupted. So I think having all three of those really helps us want to vote. And I certainly see the case for them all. I personally would love the national referendum. I think direct democracy and not having to go through these gatekeepers and say this has to go to the floor to be voted on, I think has a lot of power to it, and it's inviting because you're not just getting the candidate at the end of the day, us all fighting for Yang and Bernie. We might not get those people at the final general election because, you know, they have these primary processes in place. You have parties in place that are kind of controlling still who can get there. I think this still gives you a way to say, okay, you may not feel like you're making change with the candidates, but there's a lot of stuff down ballot. You get to have a vote on this policy. At least show up and have your voice be heard. But Joey, I saw before we move on, you wanted to raise a point. What did you want to discuss?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with Victor. It is a cost-benefit analysis, right? People are saying that, well, if I take the time to go and do all this stuff, the benefit's not going to be there. But if you also reduce the cost, like if it just showed up on your phone, boom, blockchain, done. That whole, well, what's the point? Yeah, what's the point in taking off work, driving to the polling station, blah, 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 if I'm not really going to see anything for my effort? So there's two sides to that cost-benefit analysis. I just want to say that if you bring the cost down, it's almost, it's like a straw poll online. In the time it takes you to blow
That's
your
true.
nose, you can
I certainly do a
you can
lot of
complete a
those,
straw
even
poll.
though I mean
Yeah, I do a
it's
lot of them too.
nothing.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? So
Hey, it
Mhm.
is truly there is two sides to the coin there. But let me go now to our final question for the day. So these are your three options. I'm not going to read them fully in their entirety. I sent these in advance, like I do for all of my guests, because some of these are a little bit lengthy. But I'll give them anyway. So the first is the standardized fair trade contract, with basically a 20% tariff for any country that's not following the standards. This is let us state what is America's value. Having our allies comply with that gives them economic incentive to come along the way with us. So some of the standards were like labor rights, fossil fuel emissions, civil rights, democracy, property rights, surveillance, nuclear development, geoengineering, and asylum standards of what at least I'm proposing. And then the next is public school funding. So currently we do it basically on a local level for the most part. Only 8.3% of funding comes from the federal level. And this ends up creating a lot of disparity between educational systems, where you'll have poor communities who don't have a lot of property value, not having a lot of actual funding go into their schools. And so the proposal is having the federal government provide each school district $10,000 per student. And then the final one is setting a new American scorecard, which basically pays states bonuses based on how they improve in 22 metrics. I'm not going to go through all 22, but some examples are, workforce participation rate, carbon emissions, trade balance, demographic income inequality. It's a whole suite of metrics so that we can actually start incentivizing states by giving them matching funds based on their state revenue to do good things. Because we have to not just incentivize corporations to act, but as a federal government, incentivize states to act. Because we've seen them deny stuff like Medicaid in the past, which was against their best interests. So these are a little bit more detailed policies, and so I'd happy to discuss with any fan out there that wants to actually see these proposals in details. You can have them. But guess, where do you land between these three? The real purpose of this is changing the incentives of how we are working together and educating ourselves as a society to go towards one single point. Victor, I'll start with you. Where between those three do you really land?
Yeah, up until about 5 years ago, I definitely would have come down on the public school funding of 10K per student. It was in 2014 and into 2015, and even a little bit ongoing these days. The study of what initially started out as the Trans-Pacific Partnership and has broadened into the study of free trade has really woken me up as to what the neoliberal agenda is. And we do need a radical new trade regime, something along the lines of a fair trade. So that would be where I'd come down as, if not standardized fair trade contract, at least strong fair trade contracts to operate, to interact with other countries. Fair trade would be my first choice.
Okay. How about you, Josh? Which of those three is your highest priority?
I guess my highest priority is actually same with Victor, which is the standardized fair trade contract, because I believe that this would improve not just quality of the goods, it would also improve the quality of the earth, pretty much. If you're saying that, fossil fuel emission standards or all of those other things are met, then, you know, then you're good to go. But if you're not, then you will place a heavy 20% or maybe even more,
Right.
like, um, that's great. I have a kind of a little gripe about the second option,
Sure.
which was the public school funding baseline of 10K per student. I have some sort of like a few articles that I read and a few videos that I read, which China has already started doing. They have this like headbands that are pretty much like tracking students' like attention and productivity in class. I'm just a little, kind of skeptic on that part because it might get into that point, but it's more like radical. But you know, I think the funding should be you're saying track to productivity. Are you saying track to productivity of the schools by itself or the students?
So no, it's more
Like,
like on a
outcome.
like a national standard. So basically, like we would do, for example, with like a minimum wage or something, where you would have it tracked to that, or if you're having the UBI, in which Andrew Yang has proposed to have the $1,000 increase whenever our
Oh, okay, okay.
national productivity is going up. That's what I mean.
Okay,
Not like
makes sense.
necessarily the productivity of the school itself.
All right, okay. Yeah, all right, misconception. So yeah, you're kind of like tying it to the
Peg to inflation.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, oh that's good. I guess my take with public schools and private schools are kind of more of a I want both. I want to have both options. Um, my experience with public schools is more of like uh, usually they're underfunded
Yeah, which is
and
this is
the
what we're doing
quality,
it for. Yeah, we don't want
right?
you to feel like you need to choose between public and private because a lot of the reason people feel like they want to choose between it
Mhm.
is because private is better because they have the funding for it because the public schools aren't getting the funding, and so this helps to kind of standardize where we're at with that level and not just
Mhm.
say, okay, you got your 10K now, it's going to just stagnate over time, but let that amount increase over time as we increase
Yeah.
productivity. But with that being said, Joey, do you have a thought between those three? I think both had chosen the fair trade contract as where they were going with it.
Yeah, I'm going to be the black sheep here. I think the New American Scorecard is the most profound and fundamental policy I've ever heard, ever. Because we talk about carrots and sticks, and I said it's all about the carrots. The New American Scorecard is all carrots, all sectors, all all of the life issues that matter to people. Um, I put the trade policy next because again it is good to tie it to the performance of these things, but again those are just rules, right? And then you've got compliance, you got people cheating. I mean, I used to work in manufacturing and we were able to buy our way out of standard tests, and I regret it now, but like at the time you kind of had to do it because that's to make the numbers work. So that's a prime example of you can get around these regulations, and China's great at getting around regulations and making it look like they didn't get around regulations. So, um, and I put public school funding last, not because I don't think education and funding education is important, but I think the American Scorecard kind of covers that too, right? If you change the incentives of how private businesses and municipalities and communities measure their success, the school is going to be in there. So the resources are going to drive themselves to it. Plus, if Yang gets in, he's got a whole separate proposal for education. I really do believe UBI helps outcomes in schools, paying teachers more. Just putting it into the school, I don't know if it'll work. There's another benefit to UBI that it's going to balance out populations too, because not everyone's scrambling to the same city centers. Because you have an overcrowding problem, right? It's a student to teacher ratio issue is really the big one. So if you can bring the students down, and if you pay the teachers more, you attract more and better teachers, then your ratio comes down. So I think you address a lot of public school funding issues by as a butterfly effect of the New American Scorecard.
I think that makes a ton of sense. I think for myself, I
Mhm.
think the other two, as I think you're all kind of alluding to, are really wide reaching. It's really that changing of the incentives, one being more like domestic and how states really interact and how corporations might even act with the scorecard, and having the standard fair trade contract being our incentives to the world. I think personally between the two, I really fall towards the American scorecard, is because I think if you can show how the incentivization of your own public is helping yourself, you kind of start driving behavior of other nations to want to follow you. The other policy, although I think it absolutely would work in towards of incentivizing because we are having so much social influence and we have such a large economy, but it runs the risk of, okay, you're making us do all these things. You're not necessarily doing it yourselves. Why do we want to follow you there? Why do we want to respect this? Why should we interact with you? You're a hypocritical,
Mm.
international partner. So I think you kind of need to have the American scorecard in place before the fair like contract comes into place afterwards, because then it has more like substance and weight behind it that other countries can say, oh, your model worked. We have now data on this working. Let's try and do this ourselves too. With that being said, I just want to see. Does it? Yeah,
one
Victor,
more
do you have any
question
thoughts?
of you, since it's your idea and you're laying it out there.
Yeah.
I looked at this thing. I thought, my God, what a logistical nightmare! How the hell is this ever going to be implemented?
Which one?
The
American
scorecard.
The scorecard. So that would come through actual reporting that the states would have. So these are funds that are optional. They could not do this reporting if they'd like, and they will have no access to the additional revenue funds. If you can report and show us that you are actually achieving these metric improvements, we will give you access to more funds.
So what stops them from cheating? Lying.
Lying on their metrics, well, we can go
Yeah.
through an audit process. So we can see how did you actually come to those numbers. So that's where I really see it coming into play, is you create metrics, you create the way in which it's being reported for each of those categories, and you come to some level of an audit process. So it comes kind of similarly to having oversight when you do procurement processes. This is really just a procurement process of federal funds that you've gone through the proper applications to be able to be eligible for those funds.
Yeah, there's a scorecard right now, right? It's unemployment rate, headline unemployment rate. So when states say, oh, I incentivize these companies to come in to create all these jobs. I got my unemployment rate down, so now I'm entitled to certain funds. So it's just changing the variables on that scorecard, because headline unemployment is a fiction, as we all know. So.
Yeah, so that's really how it would work. There would be just a fundamental reporting process. It's not something like I'm forcing mandatory reporting onto states. If they would like access to additional funds to be able to help their states, you can go through our reporting processes. Josh, I saw that you had an idea. What did you want to add before we wrap up?
I just wanted to change actually my decision, because I just realized that yes, the American scorecard is probably the better way, because I just realized we're talking here in the United States, and our candidates are always pointing to Canada, always pointing to UK and how their systems are working. So I think having that, fixing the problems in our home would reflect good foreign trade policies and stuff.
No, I think that's certainly understandable. I think a lot of the candidates on stage are saying, we're the ones that need to do the catch up right now. These countries are kind of starting to leave us behind. So I think you're right. We do need to prioritize our own domestic interests first. With that being said, I want to thank all three of you so much for coming on today. It was a real great time being able to chat on this. I think technology is one of the most interesting things, because it really is that source of what does the future become, because that is really what changes lives. It is helping the person, who was previously dying from disease get vaccinated. It's having this way for us to be able to communicate with each other today, to share information. I think it's super important to be able to have these topics, and so I want to thank you all for really being able to add to that conversation today. With that being said, I want to give each of you an opportunity to give a final words to the Rosebuds, plug what you have going on or things that they should go check out. Victor, I'll start with you. What should the Rosebuds go check out that you got going on?
Sure. Well, we're still doing the Bernie or Bust pledge strategy. We feel that if Bernie Sanders isn't demanded, if half of his supporters or more don't come out and say, look, Blue Party, if it's not Bernie, we're not with you this time around. So that's available at BernieOrBust2020.us, as in United States. Take the pledge and become part of the revolutionary movement.
Yes, for the Bernie supporters that are here, I know there are certainly a lot of you like that. I was Bernie Bust in 2016. I went to Jill Stein afterwards when we got kind of screwed over. But this time, I at least feel like we have a little bit more. But if that is your choice, please do go check out his Bernie or Bust website, and we'll have the description below for you. Josh, where do you fall? What do you have out there going on that the Rosebuds should go check out?
I don't necessarily have anything going on that I want to put it out there yet. I'm working on many projects that would be helping us for a more green economy. I would I would say just what stay put. Maybe follow me on Twitter at Josh Amizel, and I will be putting out something that could be very, that could help us.
Yeah, no,
So,
I think that's all of our goals here is really to move the needle forward, and we will certainly keep people updated when you do release that. But as we will do for all of our guests here, we'll have your information down below so that they can go check you out and follow you over on Twitter or any of the other media platforms you'd like them to
right,
go
yeah.
check you out on as well. With that being said, we have one more left to give our plugins in. How do you feel, Joey? What should they be checking out currently that you have going on?
I don't have anything directly to plug. I mean, you can follow me on Twitter, Joey at GDN Boss. I'll guess I'll just use my time to plug Andrew Yang. Visit
Mhm.
yang2020.com. Donate if you haven't. Follow him. And yeah, that's it for me.
Well, thank you so much to you all coming on. Before we wrap up, I want to just give a couple plugs here. One of the things I had mentioned during this episode is, yeah, I'm running for Congress here. So one of the things I have is if you want to be part of any of the online team, I usually will just give people stuff that I'm looking for some feedback on. We trade campaign strategy talk. I'm going to have a link for you all to go follow. I hope you will do that. With that being said, Rosebuds, it's been a great time being able to chat with you all again. Until next time, stay rosy.